Adam from Pink Parsnip Computers here. Just wanted to do a quick video guiding our customers or potential buyers on what to look out for when buying a used or a reconditioned PC online. So many PCs that are advertised on popular auctions platforms advertise themselves as gaming machines. And that can be the case, but there are some key things to look out for. And I'm going to run around this build now just to show you some things to look out for when buying a budget gaming PC. Now I realise this video may not be for everybody because some people watching it may absolutely have more knowledge on gaming PCs than myself, but this is really for the new buyers looking to buy a PC, whether they buy through us or whether they buy through any other third party. These are things to look out for. Okay, so first things first, if you're buying a new PC or a reconditioned PC, check out the case that it comes with. So if you're going to be using it for gaming, one of the most important things is actually airflow, because the graphics cards and the processor are going to get hotter while gaming than they would for just browsing the internet or using Windows. So it's important that the case that you buy has ventilation on the front. Now this particular case is completely mesh on the front. Some cases are solid on the front with maybe an LED strip. That's fine as long as there is an inlet of air on the side or on the top. Personally, I'd always recommend that you have fans on the front. This particular case, as it is a compact case, only has 2. Sometimes that can go up to 3. You then, in terms of airflow, you always want a rear exhaust fan. So what happens is the front fans are pulling in cold air, which is going into the PC, getting warm, and then being sucked out and chucked out of the rear of the PC by the rear fan. You may sometimes, on more expensive PCs or larger cases, also get fans on the top, which are obviously exhausting air upwards as well. So you've got out the rear and out the top. If you go for ones that have got fans on the top, I'd also recommend getting a case that has a dust shield. Now these are nearly always magnetic and they just sit on the top and they stop dust falling through into the computer and keep it nice and clean. So that's in terms of airflow. The next thing is in terms of the internals of the PC. So you've got your power supply. The power supply is exactly that. It's the unit that powers the entire PC. And these vary from anything from, say, 350 watts right up to, I've seen 2000 watt power supplies. Now, depending on the internals that you have, you need a higher rated power supply. This particular PC doesn't use a huge amount of power. It's got an Intel i5 processor, and it also has an NVIDIA GTX 1060 graphics card. Now, both of those aren't going to draw a huge amount of power, and there's lots of tools online that allow you to add in what items you have within your PC to give you a recommended power supply. Now this particular power supply is 460 watts. That's more than enough to cover the 3 fans, the motherboard, the CPU cooler and the graphics card on this particular PC. However, if you're looking at PCs that have got higher spec graphics cards, I mean like an RTX series NVIDIA, that's going to draw considerably more power. Could even be as high as 300 watts. And if you throw in then a motherboard, your CPU, any internal coolers, you're going to need a larger power supply, and that's probably on a graphics card like that need to be absolute minimum 650, but probably more like 850 to 1000 watts. But always worth checking the power supply. So check your case, check your power supply, and then you're onto your CPU. Now you've got 2 main manufacturers of CPUs. You've got AMD and you've got Intel. So AMD, the most popular processors for gaming are going to be the Ryzen processors, series 3, 5 and 7. I would avoid the older Athlon series processors. When they released the Ryzens, they were considerably better. So if you see a gaming PC advertised that's using an Athlon 64, that is an incredibly old CPU, and that is actually going to bottleneck your gaming performance. No matter what you pair that CPU up with in terms of a graphics card, that CPU is going to shackle it. Now, it's dead simple. The Ryzen 3, 5 and 7, that actually represents how many cores that they have. The higher the number, the higher the amount of cores. 4, 6 and 8 is the amount of cores. And then you have something called threads that are internally. So basically the higher the processor's amount of cores and threads, theoretically the faster it's going to perform and the better it can multitask. However, depending on what games you're looking to play, if you're looking to play esports titles like Valorant, Apex Legends, Fortnite, Rocket League, these kind of games, you do not need a top spec PC. However, you do need a platform which has enough specification within it to run those games. This particular PC would absolutely run it no problem. It is an Intel i5 6500. Now that is a 6th generation Intel, and I think we're now up to like 11th or 12th generation, so it is an old processor. However, it's a quad-core processor, and it runs at 3.2 gigahertz stock, and you can actually increase that speed if you wanted to with a decent cooler. And on the matters of coolers, this is another thing to look at. This is a brand new Arctic cooler. This is actually an entry level or a budget cooler. However, it will perform better than what we would call a stock cooler. So do keep an eye on what cooler buyers and sellers have fitted. If you are going to go for an Intel stock cooler or a Wraith cooler, which is the AMD stock cooler, that isn't necessarily a problem. Depends on the CPU. So if you're going for, say, a Ryzen 3, then the Wraith cooler is absolutely fine. But if you're going for a Ryzen 7, then that's going to generate more heat, and I would definitely recommend having a higher spec cooler. And it's the same with the Intels. If you've got a lower spec i3 or an i5 or even maybe an early generation i7, then the stock cooler will probably be fine. However, looking out at things like a better cooler does make a difference. You've then got, within here, you've got your motherboard. And that's the thing that obviously holds the whole PC together. And within that, every single internal gets plugged into that motherboard. So your graphics card, your RAM, which is the memory of the PC, your power supply, everything. And it's important to look at the motherboard because depending on what you want to do with this PC, the motherboard ultimately could either encourage you to upgrade it in the future or shackle you. So for example, this particular motherboard, which is designed perfectly for this PC, is compatible with 6th generation Intel CPUs. So in other words, you could have an i3, an i5 or an i7. It is what's called an LGA 1151 socket, and that is the model of socket that the CPU can take. So before you buy a PC, if you think you're ever going to upgrade it, have a look at what socket the motherboard has, because if it's got an older socket, you're not going to be able to put in, say, a 7th, an 8th or a 9th generation CPU, and you probably won't need that, but it's just knowing what you're buying. You've then got your RAM. Now this particular PC has DDR4 RAM installed, and I would definitely recommend for a gaming PC DDR4 minimum. And within the DDR4 RAM you have different speeds ranging from probably 2133 right up to 3600 and so on and so forth. You can even get DDR5 now. Now on an entry level budget gaming machine, you're never going to get DDR5. You're probably never going to get RAM which is faster than, say, 3200. And that isn't necessarily a problem, and it also depends on what CPU you're using. So for example, an i5 CPU of this spec will actually Intel say it'll only support up to 2133 speed. You can overclock the RAM and make it run faster than that if your motherboard supports it. So that's another thing. So know the motherboard that you're buying, know the RAM that you're getting. Importantly on RAM, if you're buying an Intel machine, which this particular machine is, a single stick of RAM is absolutely fine, as long as I would say it was 8 gig or more. If you're buying a Ryzen machine, I would absolutely double check to make sure that you get dual channel RAM, which ultimately means you've got 2 sticks of RAM running in dual channel mode. Now this particular motherboard, you can see it's got a single stick of RAM installed. There is a spare slot there. So if you wanted to upgrade this machine in the future, you could actually get up to 64 gigabytes of RAM on this particular model, because it will take 32 gig DIMMs, they're called, that's the memory modules, in each slot, total of 64. That would be complete overkill on this machine and you wouldn't need it. 8 gig is more than fine. But so you've got your CPU, you've got your RAM, your motherboard, and then finally you come down to graphics. Now this is a real bone of contention as something that annoys me personally. Many gaming PCs are advertised and they do not have a dedicated graphics card. So that means they're using the internal graphics on the CPU. Now, that's absolutely fine for everyday use. You know, using Windows, web browsing, watching videos, no problem with using internal graphics on a CPU at all. And some Ryzen chips do actually have pretty good internal graphics, and they may run eSport titles at lower settings. However, Intel chips, particularly of, say, the 600 series, the 6th generation onwards, I would definitely recommend having a dedicated graphics card. Now, this particular machine has a NVIDIA graphics card. There are 2 main manufacturers, which are NVIDIA and AMD. NVIDIA are always GTX, and they're always something like a 1060, a 1050, a 1660, or it goes up to the RTX series, which are the newer, higher spec cards, which would be like a 2060, a 27, a 3080, and so on and so forth. And this is all going to depend on your budget. If you're looking for a budget entry-level machine and you're looking for an NVIDIA card, I would always recommend looking at something from a GTX 970, which is an old card, upwards. So a 970, a 1050 Ti, a 1060, a 1660, or a 1650. They're all going to cope with those eSport titles fine, and there's plenty of videos online to support this. If you're going to go for an AMD card, then you really want to look at one of the RX series of the 480 upwards. So you've got the RX 480, the RX 470, sorry, ignore the 470, 470, 480, 570, 580, and 590. They're all going to be fine, and then you've got the RX 5500 XTs, the 6600 XTs, and so on. Anything from a 480 upwards is going to run these eSport titles no problem. It's key to look at what RAM memory you have on the graphics card. You can get NVIDIA series cards which have as low as 2 gigabytes of memory on them. That's absolutely fine for older titles like Counter-Strike Go and Valorant, but when you start playing games like Apex Legends and things, that's going to hinder you. So you probably want to go for a 4 gigabyte upwards. Now, if you see a PC that's advertised with, say, an RX 580 8 gig and an RX 580 4 gig, the actual performance of that graphics card is identical. But some games are going to be more demanding in terms of memory, so it's important to see which title you want to play and therefore what graphics cards are recommended. So some newer games like Call of Duty may require more memory than, say, Fortnite or Valorant or Overwatch, which will run absolutely perfectly on a 4 gig. And so actually, and to be honest, Call of Duty will run on a 4 gig. But if you want to high those settings up, you're going to need an 8 gig. So that's just a quick overview. The next thing you want to look at is the rear of the PC, is the connections you get with the graphics card supplied. Make sure that you have a monitor which is going to match those or the connection for it. Nearly all graphics cards now come with a HDMI, a DVI, this one, and a display port. Sometimes now on the new models you do not get a display port. Sorry, a DVI, not a display port, a DVI, this connection here. You may get a HDMI, some display ports, and you may even get a USB-C on the RTX and the newer series. So just beware of that, and I would always recommend matching your monitor with the resolution you want to play at.